Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Collecting at universities has been practiced since their beginnings. Universities had to have research and teaching facilities, so they collected objects that were useful during lectures and classes with students. In this way, rich collections of plaster casts were created and used during classes in classical philology and art history. The natural sciences amazed systematic collections of anthropological, botanical, zoological, geological, and mineralogical specimens. Medical faculties created collections of dermatology moulages as well as wet and dry models and specimens for anatomy classes. Finally, agricultural science was taught on the basis models of agricultural machinery. Today's universities have historical, scientific, and didactic collections that reflect the history of the university, its structural and material transformations. This is also the case with the University of Wrocław, which takes care of its historical collections. The exception of the Wrocław University, which takes care of its, however, is that in 1945 it changed its nationality from German to Polish. Its collections have largely been dispersed, partly also destroyed, and in today's presentation I will focus on those pre-1945 collections that, depending on interpretation, it's important, may be considered sensitive. The concept of difficult heritage has been appearing in humanistic discourse for years and continues to stir up emotions. This is due to the very definition of the concept, which supposes the existence of objects entangled in a complex historical, political, economic, cultural, or religious relationship, and for this reason, the subject of polemical discussions. For some interpreters, the difficult heritage will be the objects taken over by Poles along with all the material belongings of the German University of Wrocław in 1945, when Wrocław changed its nationality. For others, the term will be associated with the unclear circumstances under which certain objects were acquired for the collection or contemporary ethical doubts about conducting research on sensitive material. Regardless of the interpretation, the result of the discrepancy in discourse is challenges in relation to the preservation, study, and management of difficult heritage. Do we have a right to study them or an obligation? If so, with what methods? How do we care for monuments with sensitive status? The shifting of Poland's borders to the west after the Second World War and the settlement of the Polish population in Wrocław brought the new inhabitants into contact with objects that were called post-German. In recent years, the term has made comeback in literature, and what is called post-German is no longer just the subject of reportage and popular literature, but also scientific reflection. This is due to the long-lasting effects of the caesura of 1945 and the mass resettlement of the Polish and German populations in this part of Europe. For several decades after the Second World War, Poles' contact with objects left behind by their former owners in Wrocław evoked mostly negative emotions. Post-German objects directly associated with the occupation were often destroyed, and only those that were considered useful or had material value survived. The property of the University and Polytechnic in Wrocław, established by the Poles after the war, was also based on the movable and immovable property of the former German universities. The task of securing objects useful for scientific and didactic work is the future property of the university was undertaken by the scientific and cultural group consisting of 26 people who arrived in Wrocław in May 1945. It was headed by the future rector of Wrocław University and Polytechnic, Professor Stanisław Kulczyński, who had been rector of the university in Lviv in 1930s. He is sitting in the middle on this picture, of course. The first step in dealing with the post-German legacy was to secure and inventory the property. The complexity of the process initiated in 1945 is demonstrated by the fact that to this day, not all components of the confiscated property have been sufficiently researched and compiled. In particular, the most sensitive objects remained in storage for decades. These included archaeological, ethnographic, and anthropological collections. Interestingly, all three groups of collections originated from two German museums at the University of Wrocław, the Archaeological Museum and the Anthropological Ethnological Museum, which had no successors in Polish Wrocław. The collections of these museums that survived the war were vulnerable to dispersion. Some were incorporated into the collections of the faculties and institutes of the University of Wrocław, but the most valuable objects were transported to Warsaw. This dispersal was the result of the political situation related to border on the Oder, which was not recognized by the Germans, and the desire of the Polish central authorities to remove as many collections as possible from Wrocław. The aim was to supplement the depleted collections of cultural institutions in Poland during the war. As a result of these decisions, a valuable collection of Greek antiquities amassed by the German architect Eduard Schaubert in the second quarter of the 19th century was transported to Warsaw. His extensive collection, more than 300 antiquities, found its way to the Royal Museum of Art and Antiquities at the University of Wrocław in 1861 and was the pride of this unit. Dispersal began even during World War II, when the Germans evacuated selected antiquities from the collection to depots outside the city, while leaving others in the museum building, which burned down at Easter 1945. For 65 years after the war, the antiquities collected by Schaubert were considered lost, and it was only provenance research in recent years that first indicated individual relicts surviving in the collection of the University of Wrocław, and then dozens of relicts from this collection in the collection of the National Museum in Warsaw. The Schaubert's collection is an example of a difficult legacy, not only for contemporary Wrocław, but also for the guardians of a fragment of this collection in Warsaw. Its problematic nature is demonstrated, for example, by the fact that for decades after the war, the most important object from this collection, while on a permanent display in the National Museum in Warsaw, were prepared and published with a view of stylistic and formal research, but provenance studies were ignored. This lack of research was moreover due to the policies of the communist authorities whose propaganda perpetuated Polish hostility towards the German and praised the erasure of German history in Wrocław. Change in this respect was slow. It was not until the new permanent exhibition of the ancient art collection of the National Museum in Warsaw, which opened a few years ago, that objects from the Schaubert collection were provided with an appropriate commentary on their provenience. The openness to provenance research of the university collections of pre-war Wrocław today also appeals to another institution in the capital, the State or National Ethnographic Museum. In the 1950s, this institution received a large non-European collection from the Department of Ethnology at Wrocław University, which included artistic crafts and objects of everyday use of the inhabitants of Africa, Australia and Oceania, Asia and South America. At the time, almost 3,000 objects, mainly from ethnographic scientific expeditions to German colonies, were transported to Warsaw, as well as inventories of this collection. Only just over 150 artifacts were left in the collection of Department of Ethnology at Wrocław University, unfortunately without documentation. In recent years, thanks to the cooperation established, it has been possible to carry out important findings concerning this collection, if only to estimate its size, content and correlation with the modest fragment of this collection remaining in Wrocław. Provenance findings undoubtedly contribute to the knowledge of a difficult heritage, the study of which is being addressed by contemporary humanities with the many cognitive methods. Among these, the turn to things is particularly interesting in the context of museum research. Only one of the representatives of this trend is the Norwegian researcher Bjørnar Olsen, who deals with the relationship between humans and things. His reflections on human life, which is completely entangled with objects, appeal to phenomenology. Olsen shows that things have unique properties that affect our existential security and our memory of the past. This is because, in the phenomenological view, man is an entangled subject who actively participates in experiencing the world, and thus his being is an entangled existent. It seems that this methodological proposal can be applied to Poles in contact with their post-German heritage since 1945 at the University of Wrocław. The phenomenological attempt to understand their relation to the world and their entanglement with post-German things leads to reflection on the world as it appears to those who participate in it. Following this lead, this method was applied to the exhibition Things Speak, University Stories Told with Objects at the University of Wrocław Museum, which opened on 2nd July 2024. The exhibition showcases objects from the collections of the University of Wrocław that are kept on a daily basis in the various research, teaching, and administrative units. They include post-German items, both antiquities, scientific instruments, teaching aids, and objects of everyday use, such as a computer. The key of the selection was the history associated with the item, to which a relatively large amount of space was devoted in the exhibition. The aim of presenting the objects is this way to give things a voice in line with non-anthropocentric method of studying objects that emphasizes relatively symmetry in the object-human relationship. The stories told in the exhibition were focused on the thing, while at the same time aiming to show the strong relationship between object and human in line with Olsen's cited phenomenological approach to human perception. This approach assumes man's dependence on the world and his entering into a relationship with the world, which directly translates into man's entanglement with things. From the perspective of almost 80 years after the Second World War, what is interesting in the process of adaptation is the variability of the properties for which the post-German thing was and is an object of human interest. I mean, formerly material value and now more often sentimental value. Olsen rightly pointed out that despite the adapted difference between things, he would consider their resilience and being in place to be the most important cultural and socially constructive properties of objects. Taken over by the Poles in 1945, the post-German property of the university, at first alien, over the years participated in the process of shaping the identity of the new inhabitants of the city. Some objects became not only carriers of their own biography, but also of specific meanings. One more. Perhaps the way to complete the adaptation of difficult heritage is to look at post-German things in a non-anthropocentric way, to establish their provenance, to describe their biography, and to consciously include objects in the formation of human identity. The seated exhibitions at the National Museum in Warsaw and the Museum of the University of Wrocław show that making difficult heritage public with appropriate commentary provokes discussion, encourages reflection on the change in attitudes to these collections over the years, and helps to develop procedures for dealing with artifacts that constitute cultural heritage collected by another nation. Thank you very much.